So, everyone knows the Game Boy, right? Released by Nintendo at the tail end of the 80s, it was a massive success for the company, selling millions and introducing the world to the likes of Tetris. Even if you haven't played one yourself, you've probably at least heard everything I've just said before, right? After all, it's the start of a whole line of successful handhelds released by the company leading all the way to today, with the Switch. But what if it actually wasn't the starting point? Now, if you know a bit more about Nintendo's history, you've probably already known that. Yes, the Game Boy is not Nintendo's first handheld gaming system. Before the Game Boy, Nintendo released the Game & Watch. But if you look at it closely, the jump from the Game & Watch to the Game Boy seems a lot bigger than the jump between any future consoles. While each system iterated and innovated on the last, they all share the same core concept behind them, that being that they're all systems you can play a variety of games on, using a grid-based display. On the other hand, the Game & Watch is a dedicated system, meaning that each one was specifically made to only play a single game. So, what is that missing step? Well, let me introduce you to the MicroVision, the real predecessor to the Game Boy. The MicroVision was made by Milton Bradley, a company that was most well known for its toys and board games. The MicroVision was released a full 10 years before the Game Boy, and also features a dot matrix display and interchangeable game cartridges. In fact, it was the first handheld gaming system to ever do so. Now, you might be asking what makes me say that the Game Boy is based on the MicroVision. Well, thankfully I don't have to prove anything, because they admitted it themselves. In an interview with Forbes, Satoru Okada, a former manager at Nintendo R&D, said that Gunpei Yokoi, lead designer of the Game Boy, wanted Nintendo to make their own version of the MicroVision. So there you have it, Nintendo ripped off its competitors, and they got away with it too. But hang on. If that's the case, how come the Game Boy is a household name and barely anyone's ever heard of the MicroVision? Was it just dumb luck on Nintendo's side? An elaborate cover-up? Was it all just Tetris's fault? Well, how about we take a closer look at the MicroVision now? As stated before, it does indeed feature interchangeable cartridges, though they don't quite work how you'd expect them to. The cartridges make up the entire front panel of the system, including the buttons, while also including their own ROM, RAM, and CPU. The main system only consists of the LCD screen, the controls consisting of a 12-button keypad and a pedal, as well as the battery compartment for the two 9-volt batteries it needs to run. Being the first of its kind, and with MB having little experience with the production and testing of electronics, it did step into a couple of pitfalls that seem quite obvious in retrospect. A fragile and primitive LCD screen and no electrostatic discharge protection on the exposed contacts led to a huge failure rate of up to 60%. The buttons on the device are also quite fragile, only being connected to the rest of the device on one side. This combined with the fact that many games register input upon button release and not press led to many of them breaking off. The game selection also ended up being quite sparse. While 5 games released the same year as the system, only 3 more came out in the following years, all of which being made by MB themselves. Looking at it like this, it doesn't actually seem that similar to the Game Boy. How about we go back to that quote actually? Isn't it a bit unusual? Most people wouldn't go on an interview to talk about the design they made and just go, "We stole the whole thing and got away with it too." Well, how about we look at the full quote this time, with context? Because when asked about how he shaped the Game Boy, Okada said, "Yokoi wanted a Game Boy that would have looked like the MicroVision and wouldn't have lasted more than 1 or 2 seasons." Most of the interview focuses on how Okada changed the design from something intended to be a quick toy to something built to last, with him getting third-party developers on board and making sure the games had enough power to support large, high-quality games. Which might sound strange, after all, nowadays it's hard to imagine anything more limited than the Game Boy's specs, but it's actually leaps and bounds above what the MicroVision had to work with. Take for example their screens. 4 shades of green at this resolution start to feel like a lot compared to the MicroVision's black and white screen and 256 pixels. That's 256 pixels total, giving it a resolution of 16 by 16. So while the Game Boy can display things like this, the MicroVision would be able to manage a bit over half of Mario. And while this can be explained by the 10-year gap, it also shows the difference in design philosophies behind the two systems. The MicroVision simply could not have handled much beyond Connect 4 and Breakout clones that released for it, while the Game Boy was, well, built to last. But enough singing the Game Boy's praises. Enough people have done that already. We are here to look at the MicroVision and its place in history, or rather, the lack thereof. Because when you look at how the history of the video games industry is told, it's often just the broad strokes, the winners, or even just the companies still in business today. But when you look at it a little closer, you'll find things like the MicroVision. And while it really was just a failed toy, with no ripping off or other grand conspiracy taking place, there's no denying that it was truly innovative, and even its failure, it changed the gaming landscape. And I think it's worth remembering systems like the MicroVision, experiments that didn't quite work out, but that still paved the way for the gaming landscape we know today. They deserve a place in history too.